Mixtape with Scott. This is your host, Scott Cunningham. This is a podcast devoted to telling the stories or listening to the stories of living economists and telling an oral history of the economics profession over the last 50 years. This week is a guest who was the editor of my first published paper, Marianne Bitler, professor of economics at the University of California, Davis, research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, research fellow at IZA. Marianne is part of a kind of longer series, in a way, of work on causal inference. She, as you know, I've been very interested in not just causal inference, but also sort of the social history of it. And this conjecture that I've had, which is that the credibility revolution didn't spread through econometrics. It really spread through labor markets and social networks, primarily through the students of people like Card, Kruger, Emmons also, and Angrist. And what I wanted to do this year was to interview more of those students and just learn a little bit more of their story. And Marianne was Josh Angrist, in alphabetical order, his first student at MIT. It was a cohort, it was a collection of students at MIT, but Marianne was one of them. And so I was wanting to talk to her for that reason. I was also wanting to talk to her because she has a very interesting career trajectory. She went to MIT, did her PhD, but then she went into government first, and then worked her way around into academia, which is kind of interesting that we recently interviewed Wilbert Vanderklau, who went the other direction, started out in academia and then worked his way into government. And so I thought those were kind of interesting stories too, of just, the different ways that economists kind of find their way and find their home, in this career that I thought a lot of people would find really, really interesting. But also Marianne is somebody that I think this idea that one of the drivers of the economist is not just that they're good at math, although Marianne is excellent at mathematics. And that's been a common theme too. It's not just that you could say that one of the drivers of the reason of the selection of people who become economists is something about an interest in the overall well-being of humanity and a desire to study the public policies that might make it better. The wealth of nations, income inequality. And so Marianne is someone who sorted into a very strong interest of what she calls the floor on consumption, public policies that are aimed at the poorest of the American population. And so it's a pleasure to have her on the show. She's a brilliant economist and a lovely person, and has written very seminal works in applied econometrics that she's also going to tell us about, that I think actually is even played in a lot of relevance even today in this difference in differences literature that's kind of gone through its own revolution the last 5 years. So that's a mouthful, but thank you so much for tuning in. I'm going to turn it over to myself right now and Dr. Bitler as we listen to her story and her career. Thanks a lot. Okay, well, this is a really nice experience to see someone who I've actually never had extended conversations with, but was the editor of one of my very first publications, Dr. Marianne Bitler. Dr. Bitler, thank you. Marianne, thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here, and also honestly a little intimidated given some of the other folks you've had on, but here goes nothing.
Well, tell us, for the sake of the listener, your full title and who pays your paycheck.
I'm a professor of economics at UC Davis, and they pay my paycheck. And also, affiliated with the Center for Poverty and Inequality Research at UC Davis.
Oh, okay, cool. All right, great. Well, let's do an icebreaker. So tell me about a vacation that you took when you were younger. It's not necessarily your favorite vacation, but it is something that has popped in your head every now and then.
When I was in college, I finished up most of my courses in the fall of the last year I was there, and I planned a trip to Eastern Europe. And I sometimes think of that as kind of, a really fun trip, and yet it sort of challenged me because I was traveling a bit by myself. So I went to, I didn't go anyplace super exotic, but for
Mm.
me at the time, it was more exotic than, growing up in central Pennsylvania, where I grew up. And it was really an interesting time. And I thought of it recently because I had gone to Prague and Budapest and Warsaw on this trip because it was shortly after the wall fell, like in the year or so after that. And I was just recently back in Prague and reflecting how different Prague looks now. I'm sure part of it is just that I was in different parts of the city. I was there most recently for a conference, and we were staying in the old part of the city, but it certainly looks a lot more like it looks a lot more, the part of the city, maybe it was just the part of the city I was in, is a lot more similar to other parts of Western Europe than I remember thinking it was at the time when I went there in 1991.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. That's neat. I mean, the getting to do stuff as a young adult and then growing up, it's neat because you kind of had an adult's view and then you watched it really change. It is that's I actually don't know if I have had that. I've not. I only started going to Europe, I think, after grad school. So I had never got to see things back then.
I think it was also interesting because I used to travel a lot more, and now I'm sort of, middle-aged. I have children. I go to places for conferences, and I don't do the sort of, more pushing yourself, more adventurous. I'm not saying it was adventurous, but it was more adventuresome than the travel I do now. And
Right.
remembering, taking a late night train to Warsaw, like a night train, so that I wouldn't have to get a hotel room. And then I think the Uriel Pass had just become okay in Poland, and I was stopped by some ticket folks who didn't speak English, and they sort of questioned it. And so then I was sort of trying to find someone else on the train who could explain my situation to them, which happened. But, that sort of thing, I don't think I put myself out there in quite the same way now, in part because, I would just stay at a hotel and go in the morning now,
Right. Oh, that's cool. All right. Well, let's talk about your childhood. So you said you grew up in Pennsylvania. Where in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, State College. So I am part of the not so atypical experience of economists. My dad was a professor of metallurgy at Penn State, and I grew up in State College where Penn State is.
Oh, okay. Well, wait, what's Penn State? What's college? Wait, it's State College. So you said
Yeah, it's State
what
College.
what's it like as a kid?
It's a college town. It's actually, I mean, like a lot of other sort of college towns that are not terribly close to urban areas. So it's pretty there. There's mountains. It was a great place to grow up. Very much wandered around freely, and although at the same time it was sort of a not very diverse setting. Sort of it was a mix of people who worked for the university or were at the university, or then, the school district extended out a little further. So there were some other folks there, but it was a very homogeneous kind of place in a lot of ways. I mean, maybe not class wise, but certainly race ethnicity wise, it was very homogeneous, but
Mm,
it was a good place to grow up. I mean,
mm,
of course, as a kid, all you can think about when you're a spoiled kid is like, I can't wait till I get to go experience the big world out there.
right.
But
Right. What did you like to do when you were like, if I had found you on a Saturday when you were like middle school, what would I have found you doing?
probably playing sports.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, um I played soccer, basketball. A little later I took up handball, which is like not team handball like the Europeans, but sort of it's similar to racquetball. I played racquetball. So
Uh,
lots of sports.
you were always athletic.
Yeah, relatively athletic. Yeah.
Did you play sports in high school too?
Yeah, I played basketball in high school. We didn't have, so I'm sufficiently old that uh, I was born in 1967, so they didn't have girls soccer. So I I had to stop playing with a community team in around 10th grade, I think.
I see. Okay. Okay. Is your family athletic? Like your parents and stuff like that?
I think my dad was pretty athletic. He skied in college and he sort of played handball. That's how I took it up. He was a handball player, so I took it up with him, and he sort of, I mean, not like, it was an important part of our lives. I'm not going to say we're like, we're just normal people who exercise a lot, but it was an important part of our lives. So,
Hmm. 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 Well, so how big was your high school? Was it a pretty big one or small?
yeah, I think it was about 2,000 students,
Hmm.
although it was weirdly split into two buildings, one for ninth and 10th grade and one for 11th and 12th grade.
Hmm. Okay. What kind of classes did you enjoy the most back then?
Probably my favorite classes were math and history.
Oh yeah.
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 So I took AP history. I loved American history and world history. And then in Pennsylvania, you also got a year of Pennsylvania history, just as I think in most states, you get some
Yeah.
sort of history that's tailored to the place where you grew up.
Oh, I
So
bet that, yeah. And it's like Pennsylvania has got a big part of the story of America, so it's pretty cool. Um, well, so when you were what would your teachers have said about you as a student back then if they had tried to describe you?
I think they would have described me as quiet, but serious.
Yeah.
Um, uh, I think that probably would have been most of it. I mean, I loved math, so I think I was on the, super nerdy on the math team,
Oh,
did,
you were on the math team?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, all of that, those sorts of things.
Okay. Okay. Well, so what did you want to be when you grew up in high school?
I I think when I finished, I knew I wanted to do some sort of science, but science or math or engineering, but I wasn't sure what. And I actually enrolled in, they had a program called engineering science.
Mhm.
And then I had my first set of labs, and then it was made clear to me that, the lab part was not my strong point. So I was taking an AE class, and my project, like everybody else's circuit things, looked really nice and well put together, and mine were sort of a train wreck. So I switched to math then, which was more suitable.
Yeah. Okay. So was it always kind of like predestined that you thought you would go to Penn State?
I think I could have gone somewhere else, but it was at the time I don't know, I think they still offer this, but you got half tuition off if you went to Penn State. And so that sort of made it quite inexpensive to go.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you know, that seemed like a good option. I think it worked out well for me. It was a sort of very diverse place. So you could kind of have any experience you wanted, but also you could sort of find research experiences, to get a bit more of a sense of what stuff was like.
Yeah.
And I also think, it was a big advantage I mean, I think it's an advantage for anyone who's going to college, whose family has folks who understand the system, to be able to take advantage of it. But it definitely helped because I sort of understood how to figure out what professors to talk to. All these things that I see a lot of students in my undergraduate classes, they don't quite understand how to take advantage of these things because they don't have the same, advantage of having parents who sort of experience the system.
Right. 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 Well, did you take any econ classes at Penn State?
I took one I took one introductory micro or macro course. I think
Oh,
it was like a combined course, actually. And then I helped a friend who was an international relations major. But, for part of the time, I didn't have that much to do because I didn't have very many classes to finish up in the fall when I was getting ready to complete. And I I sat in on her trade class, and helped her sort of pass the trade class. So I really
oh.
enjoyed that, sort of the simple trade models.
So is
Um,
that when did you get interested in econ just from that experience, or was it just sort of light?
no, it was a little bit different from that. So when I went off to I so after college, I applied to PhD programs in math and history. Um, and it's a lot harder to get supported to get a PhD in history. So I pursued the math path. I went to the University of Minnesota for a year, and I was sort of unsure if it was the right thing for me because it just wasn't around about the world around us. So I
You
took
were
a class.
already kind of, yeah, because you got this history. I was curious if you got this history side, it's like you're kind of interested in humans and human life,
Yes.
right?
Yes. And
Yeah.
so I ended up, they have an applied economics, you know, department as a land grant school. And so I took some econ classes over there, and I got connected to Ed Green, who was a theorist who taught the sort of first class there.
Yeah.
And, you know, I sort of realized, okay, I probably don't want to stick this out. And he had connections at the Federal Reserve Board. And so he encouraged me to apply for a research assistantship. And so I applied to be a RA, and then I went off to the board for a couple years, and then I applied to PhD programs.
Oh, so you went to the Federal Reserve Board.
Yeah, as a research assistant for 2 years.
Oh, oh, that's very common. It seems like that's not terribly uncommon now with these pre-docs, but was that common back then to be an undergraduate? Well, you had done this master's.
No, I didn't have a master's. I
Oh, you
just did
didn't
the,
have the master's.
yeah.
Oh,
I don't know about common, but there were plenty of research assistants at the board. I mean, who would come in and, you know, about a third, I think, a third to half would go and get PhDs in economics, and the other ones would go, you know, figure out economics wasn't for them. So people, you know, stayed on, they got stats degrees. More commonly, I think they got law degrees or MBAs after this.
mhm. Well,
So
so
there's a cohort of folks that I knew who did that.
what do you think about? So, what was sort of the eye-opening experience at the Fed? This was Minnesota.
No, no, it was the Board of Governors in DC. So I
Oh,
was actually working in the monetary studies section, which is in then was in monetary affairs. So they did the sort of uh, forecasts about the you know, the nominal side of things. So it was interesting seeing sort of what was important for policy and sort of this important process of, you know, doing the forecasts every so often before the Federal Reserve Board meetings. And it was also, there was a lot of emphasis on training for the research assistants. So that's sort of where I first got a taste of econometrics. So they had some lectures, and they had some resources available for us. And so that was also um, pretty good. And I learned a little bit about you know, programming and some diverse languages. So it wasn't R then, but we used S plus, which
oh,
was
yeah.
it's like a commercial version of R.
Huh. So you weren't using Stata, you were using, was there Stata back then?
I
90.
don't know if there was, but everybody, I was in this, you know, macro section. So I think people used rats and
Yes,
Gauss, and
right.
then S plus for a lot of things.
Oh, did you find that you sort of had a natural aptitude for programming and working with
I
data?
mean, I I don't I mean I don't know if I would totally the other person in my cohort of RAs was probably originally a better programmer than me. I think I might have caught up by the end of the time, but I think he'd had more experience. He's a finance professor now.
Oh, okay. So
Actually, he's
what?
an econometrician. He has time series econometrics and finance.
Oh,
Chris Jones.
oh, okay, okay. So you go through, you must go through a bit of a change, from the day one to day zero plus T. What what changes inside you? Because you obviously you decide at the end that you want to become an economist, right? That was not at the beginning what you were thinking, was it?
No, I think it was just more you know, I'd always enjoyed math, and it had been easy for me you know, I mean, it got progressively a little bit, you know, it got harder over time, but it had always been easy for me, and I enjoyed the puzzle aspect, but it was just so removed from the real world. And so I would sort of sit there and listen to NPR and do my homework and sort of be more interested in sort of some of the questions about the world that would come up on, you know, NPR than like, you know, the goal of solving the solutions. I mean, not that everybody finds homework boring sometimes, but
Yeah.
I think that it just didn't provide enough excitement on its own, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what led me to want to do economics, because I knew that sort of my math skills would, be valued there relative to some other things. But
Right.
at the same time, there would be the ability to sort of study people and work on issues that I cared about, sort
Yeah.
of for other reasons.
Yeah. Well, who had the biggest, what were there professors or were there some sort of experiences that like really seminal experiences or people there that at the Fed that really had a pretty notable impression on you when you think back?
David Wilcox was in my section. He wasn't the section head, but he sort of had a long storied career at the Fed. And then now he's at the Pearson Institute. I think he's still affiliated with the Pearson Institute and of International. I don't remember what the last letter in the acronym stands for.
Yeah.
Um, and he was very successful research wise, but he really cared about, policy as well. And he sort of had this dual ability to care about both of these things and yet still also sort of try to be a good mentor to us. I mean, not that the other people in my section weren't good mentors, because they were, but I think he really stood out to me for sort of having this dual interest in policy and in sort of, the field for its own sake.
Mm-hmm. Right. So so what year is it when you apply for grad schools?
1993.
I mean, you end up at MIT and was it, were you sort of just the kind of student that had a lot of self-confidence that you were just like, I'm going to go to the best school in the country. I'm going to like in the whole world. I'm going to sit and they're crazy if they turn me down. I mean, or have you always been that kind of person?
I think you've seen me in other professional settings, Scott. I don't think very many people would describe me as that person, but I think, sort of succeeding up to that point and then being at the Fed, and then the Fed RAs tended to go to very good schools. So I applied to a large variety of schools, including some that I was more sure I would get into, and then some I was less sure that I would get into. But it seemed, so I had some friends who were sort of like the RAs come in cohorts, just like, people graduate from college and they go off usually to do this. And so there were some folks ahead of me. There was one person who'd gone to MIT. And so that sort of, helped me feel as though like I could succeed there.
Oh, okay. So you kind of did have a sense of like, you kind of felt like from talking to this person, you're like, man, I could see myself there and doing well.
Yeah, or at
Yeah.
least this person who I know who did this other stuff that's like what I do now is successful doing this.
Right. Well, so what was it like, when you get there? I mean, what's it like as I mean, MIT is the best program in the history of the planet. So like if I stepped foot there, I would just be like wide-eyed. What was it like for you as a first year?
So it was sort of a combination of things. So on the one hand, I think the math skills made a lot of the first year much easier for me than it was for many people. On the other hand, my lack of economics, I think, I think back then you still had to take the economics subject test to get into PhD programs. And so I'd studied a lot for that to try to, get a good enough score, but I certainly didn't have as extensive a background in economics as a lot of the other folks in the program. And so sort of, I think the things I struggled with and the things they struggled with were different. But I also just remember, to that point, I'd always just done all the work. It just had never been a thing where you didn't do all the work. And so I'm sure this is true of every PhD program. At MIT in your first year, you take one of the fields that you're going to take. And I took public economics, and I had Jim Paterba, who was a co-chair of my committee along with Josh. And, I worked for him as an RA, and, the syllabus is, I don't know, 40 pages, and there's like 10 papers assigned for each thing. And in my head, along with some of the other folks in my class, we thought, oh, we're supposed to understand everything about all of these papers. And so I remember just feeling like I can never possibly keep up with this,
Right.
not realizing that this was more meant to be a tool to come back to sort of know if this was the area you were interested in, this is how you figure out more about it.
Mm, mm.
And I think it was also sort of a sort of strange setting because, well, certainly I wasn't the most cosmopolitan amongst my classmates, let's just say. I mean, I come from a very privileged background, but, there were a wide variety of people who are much more cosmopolitan than me. And so, again, I think this came from having come from math, but I took some great advice from some classmates ahead of me when, we had brown bags and you would present work in progress. And they said, memorize the first few minutes of your presentation so that you can give it in this like organized, cohesive way, which would, of course, that probably just wouldn't have occurred to me because I just wasn't as used to, giving oral presentations as a lot of the folks who sort of had done debate and the like.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, okay.
But
So,
it was a great experience too. I mean, it was certainly one of the most intellectual. I think this is true for everybody for grad school. It's one of the most intellectually stimulating times in your life because you're surrounded by people, you're learning a lot. There's other people who are learning a lot. You can learn a lot from the other folks, and then after that, hopefully you maintain some of that with your co-authorship relationships, but it's not going to be like that intense learning that you do in your second and third year of graduate
yeah,
school.
yeah, yeah. Sure, sure. So, why do you pick public? Did you have any priors that would have been the right? What was it about that drew you to it? Because you
It
had trade stuff and you got this like really strong math background. You probably could have sorted. You could have, and you're at the Fed. You could have gone to macro. So, what was it about public?
I think it was just wanting to sort of understand the programs that the sort of exist to help, means tested programs that exist and social insurance programs that exist to help people and
Mm,
provide insurance to people. So I sort of knew that a combination of that and then so there's these more micro topics where you can often imagine what the decision makers' choices are,
yeah.
maybe not what all the constraints are, but, sort of more about studying the social safety net. So I sort of knew pretty early, and I was lucky that I was taking public my first year because that was helpful for this, to sort of get this lens on things. Although I also enjoyed my labor courses, obviously.
So remind me again, the first year you take public, what year is it? 92, 93,
It's 94.
94. And when does the welfare reforms start to happen?
So that was already like some of the waivers started in 93, but I don't think I was really very aware of it as a topic then, although I was hearing about it more, say, on the radio in 1996.
Uh,
So August 1996 is when Perora gets signed. But my dissertation wasn't about that. My dissertation was about two of the papers were about the child support system.
mm,
Sort of time and money for absent fathers, because obviously if you have to have to pay more child support, you have less time to spend with your children.
yeah.
And then a paper about labor supply. And
Mm.
then the third paper was actually on the WIC program, which I've continued to study throughout the rest of my career.
So you were just interested in these, I might have called them just anti-poverty programs, but you're kind of calling them like insurance. Was
Well,
that
I
right?
think I think you can think of them as a floor on consumption. So, they
Oh,
satisfy this redistribution thing. I mean, but I mean, part of the program, part of the public course was also a variety of social insurance programs like Social Security. I mean,
yeah.
so the second course team, uh, was team taught by Peter Diamond and John Gruber.
Oh,
And sort of
so
my research is probably closer to what Gruber does than what Jim Paterba is necessarily known for. But
yeah. Could
he
you
taught
have
the tax.
could you have predicted like in high school that these would have been your interest? You've got this interest in history, but would you have thought that, yeah, I'm going to be interested in a particular kind of public policy that's very focused on the poorest people in the country, floors on consumption? Is that something now looking back you can sort of see that this was always coming?
Maybe a little bit. I mean, so in 10th grade, we had a world history class and then in 11th grade, I guess it must have been, we had American history. And I remember being sort of drawn to thinking about a lot of these, question about, the New Deal and sort of not so much the war on poverty, but the civil rights era and sort of, other sort of questions that are about like access to various opportunities for everyone. But probably not. I think if you'd asked me in high school, I would have said I'd be doing something related to math.
Mm. Well, so you've got Josh. I was joking with you earlier that you're like Josh Angrist sent me his list of his students, and it was like Marianne Bitler's like number one on the list. But you told me it's not quite accurate. But I was just kind of curious.
Alphabetically, I'm probably one of the first.
Alphabetically, that's right. That's right. You and I would have been in the same row in the same class. You'd been in that first row, and I'd been in the back of the first row. So okay. Tell me how you ended up hooking up with him since you're doing all this public stuff. I mean, so what was it that drew you to Josh? He'd been there just a couple of years, right?
Yeah, I think maybe he'd been visiting part of the time before when I was there. And so then he taught, he just sort of had this different way of, well, so I'm trying to think back. So he team taught a course with Steve Pischke that I was later the TA for, even though labor was like one of my minor fields. And I just remember being drawn to this approach of sort of trying to study these questions with these statistical approaches that you could sort of see in the data as well. Sort of that was very enticing. And he's obviously a very charismatic teacher, as anybody who's sort of seen him present. I mean, so I think I really was drawn to the econometric piece of it.
Yeah.
And it was sort of right in right when he was in the thick of things with Hito and Rubin and sort of developing all these approaches.
Yeah. Did you notice it? Like, did you notice that there's something different, like this potential outcomes model or the way that they're like approaching instrumental variables in this like brand new way? Did it strike you as unusual? Because I mean, it was like you're learning all of it at the same time. So you might not necessarily feel like any of it's particularly novel. It's like it's all novel.
No, I think in the first year we sort of had simultaneous equations. And I mean, there's so much material. I mean, I think this is many people's experience. You sort of learn stuff when you're taking your first, year of econometrics, but you don't really absorb everything that you're doing. And then later on, like slowly it became clear that this is a slightly different way of thinking about the world.
Yeah.
But I think that they were staggered because I had labor in my second year.
Uh-huh.
So it was after I'd sort of had these, core econometrics
Oh, so he's
time
teaching
series.
labor. He's not
Yeah.
teaching econometrics.
No, he wasn't. He taught an applied econometrics course that was like an option, but there was, no, I had Jerry Hausman and Whitney Newey, and then a time series course as well. But
Yeah.
obviously, we all had to take a time series course.
Well, so who were your buddies that were also in your cohort? I know that you and Jonah Gelbick overlap. Who are who are some other people that you've kept up with from that time?
I was in the class ahead of me, but we were, both had worked for Jim Paterba, and we were friends. So in my class at the time, Annette Vissing Jorgensen, who, is now at the Board of Governors, but, she was at initially at Chicago and then Northwestern and Berkeley in the finance department. Although she didn't take these same classes. Jeff Kling, he was also the year ahead of me. Julie Cullen in the year ahead of me. Kim Rubin was a couple years ahead of me. She was also a research assistant for Jim. So there was a set of people who sort of worked for Jim who had an office that was like in the department. And so, and then behind me, Sudanarski.
Mm. Well, did you feel like you were getting all this causal, credibility revolution stuff at that beginning, or did it not feel that way?
I don't think I realized how different it was from what things had been for people who maybe had come 5 years before that. I
Uh,
think it was after some of this had happened. And so it was just what we learned, I think is
I,
how I would describe it.
yeah.
And so I just don't think that I had the expansive view of all of it to sort of see that that's what was happening. But
Mhm.
then it became clear once I sort of got out into the world a little bit.
Mm. So you graduate and you go back into the government. You kind of bounced from the FTC to the Federal Reserve and then Rand Corporation. So can you tell me a little bit about that sorting into the government as your first jobs? Because it's not as common to
Sure.
see government back into government then academia. So I'm curious about how this all worked.
Yeah, so I certainly, first of all, I wouldn't recommend it as the easiest path, but it also had a lot of advantages in that I had a lot of experiences I never would have had otherwise. And certainly, when I was at the Board of Governors, I got to work on a survey, which I think has been an invaluable part of my training because I think that is something that we as economists don't do as good a job of training our students about data collection as, say, sociology or demography do.
Yeah.
So it was a great experience, but certainly not the easiest path. I think when I finished, I thought, uh, government would be a way to, maybe naively make something of a difference while, still, getting to do things that maybe I cared about. And then I think having not really had a very real job with a real boss before, realized that, you know, well, so first of all, the FTC, there wasn't really a time for research, and I had an interest in sort of continuing some research. And so, I mean, I probably could have found if my interest had gravitated towards more IO topics, I think it would have been fine, but that sort of wasn't so natural for me.
Yeah.
And so then at the board, it was clear, it would be uh, it would be the best fit if what you were interested in doing research on fit into what the Fed cared about. And I sort of, had interests that, you share, I think, sort of thinking about um, topics like abortion legalization, where, that's not exactly in the mandate of the Fed. And
You were
so,
working on this stuff at these positions like the FTC and the Fed, and like what? It's like almost like your side hustle almost. You've got this
oh
like
yeah, yeah, no,
agenda
it
that
was
doesn't
not what I was
fit.
spending. No, I was not spending like my work day on those things. No,
Oh,
it was just more that I cared about these topics, so I wanted to keep working on this stuff. And I
mm,
thought going to Rand to take a postdoc, it was sort of at the boom, like shortly before, in the late 2000s, it seemed like a great time to go take a postdoc and then check out the job market again.
oh,
Um,
oh, okay.
so that's how I ended up at Rand. And then I got hired at Rand after that. And then I moved around some more. But have not moved for a while now.
Yeah.
I've been at Davis since 2015.
Well, so this paper, I wanted to talk a little bit about this paper with Jonah and Hillary Hoynes. There's actually a few papers, but I'm thinking of your 2006 AR, What Mean Impacts Miss, Distributional Effects of Welfare Reform Experiments. I'm in a Slack channel with Pedro Santana and Andrew Goodman Bacon, and they talk about this paper a lot. Andrew talks about it a fair amount as being like this paper that he really learned a lot about thinking of heterogeneous treatment effects. And as he kind of tells the story, even of all this two-way fixed effect stuff, these heterogeneous treatment effects. So it's turned out to be your most cited paper. And I was just kind of curious, can you tell it for the sake of the listener, what's this paper about?
So I think what this paper does is so at the time that I was learning econometrics, a lot of approaches just were focused on a single beta. So there was no beta I, there was just a beta. And it was a population parameter, and you were trying to estimate it.
Right.
And in this paper, we made this connection between a simple static model of labor supply in the presence of this strange budget set that the state of Connecticut adopted as part of their welfare reform that has a gigantic notch in it, and what we could estimate. Okay, so the static model predicted that, because there's a notch in the budget set, as you could, what do we think happens when there's a notch in the budget set at the top? Some people will reduce their labor supply in order to become eligible for this bonus payment because the tax rate was 0 on welfare up to this point, and then you lost the entire welfare grant. Okay.
Yeah.
But if you go further down, people moved from a previous system where they had nearly 100% tax on their earnings to a system where up to the poverty level, they had a 0% tax on their earnings. So the static model predicts that some people should enter the labor market and some people who are working should work more. Okay.
Yeah.
And so we had experimental data from the state of Connecticut, because one thing that was great for research, and I think for what we understand about these programs with the welfare reform, is DHHS, I think, decided that they had to evaluate these initial welfare waivers to see whether they were cost neutral. So they did a whole bunch of randomized control trials across different states to test out their welfare reforms. And we used the data from Connecticut, and what we found was exactly this pattern of effects using distributional approaches, using QTE, quantile treatment effects, that is consistent with this static model. And so we found, no effects for some part, because there's a lot of this welfare population that doesn't work at all. Then a positive effect of being in the treatment group where you get access to this 0% tax rate with your earnings. And then at the very top, some evidence of reduced labor supply consistent with people reducing their labor supply to qualify for this, windfall benefit. And so there's this connection between this heterogeneity in terms of one's response across different percentiles of the earnings distribution and the static model. And I think that's what made this paper a success for us, was it connected these predictions of the theory with this heterogeneity that we could uncover using this tool, which wasn't brand new. There's been QT for a long time, and lots of people have worked on this in a whole bunch of different disciplines. And, Roger Kenker's been working on this forever in economics, but sort of had not been applied so frequently in quite this way. But I think the connection of the model with the econometrics that sort of made it, work.
What in your community of economists, these public economists? So basically, it's like they must be appreciating that there's this static model that would imply all this heterogeneity, and there's a particular econometric model that's kind of not satisfying or something. What was the reaction that people had to the overall paper that you sort of noticed at the time?
So at the time, Heckman and co-authors like Jeff Smith and lots of others had a lot of papers sort of thinking about QTE and rank preservation and all of these questions that sort of do imply that, you can't, from the marginal distributions, which is what we compared to get these QTE, you can't necessarily draw conclusions about individuals' responses unless you're willing to make assumptions about where people are located in the distribution. And so there was a reaction on that side. Then there's was more of a reaction that, like, actually this wasn't some sort of fundamental heterogeneity. It was probably just that, the people who we thought were, at the top were actually maybe people who had some different set of characteristics. And that actually led to a second restat paper for us, where we sort of tried to take seriously the suggestion that maybe what we were capturing, like the suggestion had been, well, if you took the right set of X's, you would find something more akin to constant treatment effects within various subgroups defined by these observable characteristics.
Oh,
And so
Huh.
that's what led us to this second paper where we tried to sort of show that that was not the case. And there was just an enormous amount of heterogeneity, within group that swamped a lot of the cross group heterogeneity. And I think that has also been true in other contexts like education settings. I mean, obviously, you only work on so many things, but
Right.
in many of these different settings, there's just enormous amounts of heterogeneity. And, in a paper with Hillary and Thad Domina, where we look at the Head Start impact study, we also sort of, you can look across different groups and see that there appears to be heterogeneity, even if you sort of take the distribution where you're comparing things at the same spot in the control group, you sort of still see heterogeneity in the effects for different groups, which, I mean, in the educational context, sometimes you can predict from various things. In our setting, it's about what language the kids who are in this preschool experiment speak at home.
Mm. Well, how do you think, what's the biggest thing you think as a result of those projects, how do you think that you're different or that you think differently as a result of these projects you did with Jonah and Hillary?
I think that it has made me try to consider whether theory or the setting might have implications for why you would see various kinds of heterogeneity before starting a project, and to sort of try to think about what's the most suitable approach to a particular question. And I think it also, sort of makes something like this staggered difference attention to sort of differences in treatment effects across locations over time, not even remotely surprising, given this
Right.
enormous heterogeneity that seems to show up across all these other dimensions.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's a natural, thing that has stuck with me about this.
You think that this is coming? I mean, you and Jonah both are Josh's student, and he's got this, at that time, this local average treatment effect paper, which has heterogeneous treatment effects conceptually in it. I mean, is this just something that might have been baked into y'all's DNA a little bit, or is it really just coming from this like theoretical model driving this? You didn't need all that late stuff to kind of be thinking this way.
I'm sure it helped. I would say, like, at the time, did I have a broad enough view of econometrics to really understand things the same way I do now? Probably not. Maybe
Yeah.
Jonah did. Maybe Hillary did. I'm not sure if I did, but I think it was baked into me without me even necessarily realizing it. That
Hmm.
might be how I would describe it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, how come you guys worked so well together, do you think? I mean, I've heard somebody say, once you find these teams that you work well together, you just need to not break up. It's like, y'all need to work together. How come you guys worked so well together?
I think when we started, so Jonah and I were good friends in graduate school. And so that was part of it. We became very interested in working on welfare reform. And then we got connected to Hillary, who was also working in this. So I think a piece of it was, that we had this friendship bond and had sort of been trained the same way across a whole bunch of things. And we were also, very, like, all three of us were very substitutable at the time. So I'm sure you have had this experience where you have some co-authorship partnerships where you're, you know, substitutes, and some where you're complements, and
Yeah.
maybe you're more productive when you're complements, but it's kind of more fun when you're substitutes.
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah.
I think at the beginning that was a big piece of it, and we had this substantive interest that also brought us together, and it certainly helped that Jonah and I were in the same. So this was before Zoom, obviously, but before Skype, when you could do phone calls. And so it was enormously helpful, I think, at the beginning that Jonah and I were in the same location. And then it turned out that, I was moving to Rand, which was in Southern California, and Jonah went to go do a RWJ postdoc for a couple years. And I spent some of the time, in between places. And so it was easier for us to collaborate, I think,
Yeah.
just the ability that we were like, neither one of us had children. Hillary had children, but she was living in Berkeley, and Jonah was, in Berkeley. And so that made it that really reduced the cost of the collaboration. But I really think it was this sort of shared interest in this question. And then also to some extent in like exploring some of these more methodological issues than maybe was the core piece of some of our other welfare reform work.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then Jonah decided he wanted to be a lawyer and study civil
Lawyer.
procedure. And, he still does econometrics, but he's not
He
so
had to-
interested in these questions anymore.
he broke up the Beatles. He broke up the team.
Yeah. But Hillary and I continue to be interested in these means tested programs and have continued to work together for a long time.
Okay. It's funny when I was in grad school, I actually only, because I did not study this type of public policy, I really only knew of your work with Madeline Zavadny on abortion. Can you tell me a little bit about the history of that work?
Sure. So we were also friends in grad school. Madeline was a couple years ahead of me, and we were both interested in this question. And we started working on it together. And it was my first publication, actually, was in the Journal of Health Economics with Madeline. I'm sure it wasn't her first publication. She has a very active research agenda on immigration, and the minimum wage at the time was what she'd done her dissertation on. But we were again, deeply interested in this question in terms of, unexpected consequences for women and families and children when you take away access to abortion. And
what was the policy lever that was being studied?
So the first paper was about waiting periods and other restrictions on abortion timing. And so, when
like Mississippi, mandatory waiting, is it like Mississippi and a few other states? I can't remember these states anymore.
It was policies similar to that, as well as like some parental restrictions,
notification,
some of the other things we studied. And, we combined, so I guess if I were describing my own work, I think there's like also an effort to try to use the tools that are right everybody does that, but let me say it differently. I like learning new tools. Other people maybe don't enjoy that as much. So for me, that's a plus when I get to learn something new for a paper. We used a couple different data sets. We used CDC reports of abortions, and we also used the Guttmacher Institute ones, and we did some archival work maybe not really archival, but we dug up some data on abortions to look at, adoptions, to look at the effects of legalization of abortion on adoptions, which was kind of an interesting question. And then we were led to think about, the effect of restricting access to abortion on child abuse.
Oh, wow. Oh, then that's why you handled my paper at Economic Inquiry on foster care.
Exactly.
Oh, okay. Now it's all coming together. Oh, that's neat. Okay. So do you and Madeline still work together? Do y'all still, with so much, it seems like the abortion literature has just exploded even more with all the supply side restrictions and even these big changes. Are y'all still working together?
No, we the last paper we worked on was about the Medicaid expansions of the mid 1980s and early 1990s that, were in the Curry and Gruber and Cutler papers on fertility behavior. And we had such a challenging time getting that paper published that I think it maybe soured us both on this some of these questions. And both of our research, my research has evolved more to be about these safety net programs with some amount of economic demography still involved, but it's not the main thing that I do. And, Madeline's work has moved towards immigration and, where she's an expert.
Right. Well, so it's top of the hour, and I wanted to kind of close with something. So I sometimes ask my guests if you could go back and talk to your old self when she was a student, what do you think has been one of the best lessons you've learned that you wish you could tell her? It could be about papers, but it doesn't have to be. You know, what is it that you sort of think you could say, this has really been a special thing I've learned, and you would like to tell her that?
I would go back and say, go spend some time around demographers and sociologists when you're in grad school, which was not something that was, easy to do at MIT. And take more econometrics and more stats. If I could go back, I would take the second year advanced sequence in econometrics, and I also would have tried to take some things in the stats department. I think those would have been the things that professionally would have been the most useful for me.
What would you have substituted out of though? If you had to,
I don't know. I was in a hurry. I was like convinced I wanted to be done with graduate school quickly. So I think it would not have been too difficult to stay for a fifth year, and I could have fit in
you
some of
finished
that.
in 4.
Yeah.
Oh, got it. Yeah. Great.
I'm sure I would have also, benefited from another year before going on the job market, but that's not the reason that I say any of this.
Yeah, sure. No. That's right. Yeah. Well, it's so nice to get to talk. I feel like this is such a nice time for us to talk and for you to share your story with me. I really appreciate you being so open about everything.
Sure. No, I hope you can winnow this down into an interesting conversation. I look
think
forward
so.
to hearing it.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, you have a great day.
Thanks.